A blind veteran's daughter is targeted by bikers, but what happens next will make you surprised. It was a cold, rainy evening, and the old diner on the outskirts of town was one of the few places open. The place had seen better days. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting a pale glow on the cracked parking lot. And inside, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Jessica, a young woman in her mid-20s, staring out of the window as rain drummed steadily against the glass. She had long brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, a well-worn leather jacket and jeans. Her sharp features and quiet demeanor reflected the strength and resilience she'd inherited from her father, a blind war veteran who had raised her to be independent and strong-willed. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of truckers and a waitress wiping down the counter. Jessica quietly sipped her coffee, trying to ignore the faint hum of anxiety that had been building inside her all day. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something dark and inevitable. It had been years since her father had his run-in with a local gang of bikers over a property rights dispute, but she had never forgotten the way they humiliated him, and though she'd never admit it, the fear still haunted her. Suddenly, the door to the diner swung open with a loud creak, and the calm atmosphere was shattered. A group of 6 rough-looking bikers swaggered in, their loud voices filling the space as they shook off the rain. The leader, a hulking man named Snake, walked in front, his presence alone enough to make the other patrons shrink back. Snake was infamous around these parts. Tattoos covered his muscled arms, a thick, scraggly beard framed his menacing face, and his eyes were cold, sharp, and calculating. The rest of the group followed, equally intimidating, their leather jackets creaking as they took seats at the counter. Jessica felt the air grow heavy with unease, but she stayed in her booth, hoping to go unnoticed. However, as soon as Snake spotted her, a cruel smirk spread across his face. He nudged the man next to him and whispered something, setting off a chorus of mocking laughter. It didn't take long for their taunts to begin, echoing through the small diner. "Well, well, well," Snake drawled, leaning back in his seat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ain't that the daughter of old blind Bob? Wonder how he's getting along these days. Still stumbling around in the dark, I bet." Jessica's jaw clenched, but she refused to look up. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup, and she willed herself to stay calm. But the bikers were relentless. "Maybe he'll bump into something valuable one day," another chimed in, followed by more snickers. "Too bad he couldn't see the mess he made last time. He tried to play hero with us." Snake's mocking grin only widened as he stood up, his boots thudding heavily on the floor as he made his way toward her. The tension in the diner thickened with every step he took. He stopped right in front of her booth, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. Snake leaned down, his face inches from hers, and sneered. "What's the matter, sweetheart? Daddy can't come to your rescue anymore?" Jessica's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay composed, staring straight ahead. She wouldn't let them see her fear. But when Snake reached out and knocked her coffee over, the liquid spilling across the table, a flicker of fear danced in her eyes. Snake noticed it, and his expression darkened. "Don't think you're so tough just because you can sit here all quiet. You're just like your old man, weak and blind to what's really going on." For a moment, there was silence. The whole diner seemed to be holding its breath. Jessica's hand slipped into her jacket pocket, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She felt the cool surface of her phone and knew what she had to do. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Ever since that day when her father stood up to these bikers and nearly paid the price, she had always known it was only a matter of time before they came looking for payback. She glanced down at the phone, her thumb hovering over a familiar number. Her father may have been blind, but he wasn't helpless. He had connections, and he had warned her this day might come again. With a deep breath, Jessica pressed the call button and brought the phone to her ear. Her voice was steady, but low, as she spoke into the phone. "Dad, It's happening again. The tension in the diner shifted immediately. Snake, who had been grinning with twisted satisfaction, faltered for a second. Jessica could hear her father's calm, steady voice on the other end, even over the pounding of her own heart. She knew she wasn't alone. Across town, in a modest, weathered house, Jack sat in his worn armchair, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. The steady ticking of the wall clock filled the silence of his small living room. Jack, a retired veteran in his late 50s, had long ago lost his sight, but his mind remained sharp, honed by years of combat and hardship. His hair had turned a salt and pepper gray, and deep lines etched his face, each one a reminder of the battles he had fought, both on the battlefield and in life. Though his eyes no longer worked, his other senses had sharpened over the years, giving him an awareness that most would envy. The ringing of his phone cut through the quiet, and as soon as he answered and heard Jessica's voice, his heart skipped a beat. He could sense the tension in her voice, the subtle tremor that told him she was in danger. Jessica had always been his strength, his anchor, and the thought of her in harm's way sent a surge of urgency coursing through his veins. It brought back memories of distant firefights, of the adrenaline he had learned to control, and of the battles he had thought he had left behind when he retired. He didn't hesitate. Jack's hands, steady despite the storm inside him, reached for his cane. He moved through his house with the precision of someone who had long since memorized every corner, every piece of furniture. But before he headed out the door, he did something else. He made a call. There was only one person who could handle a situation like this without causing more trouble than necessary. His mind flashed to the days of his military service and to the face of a man he trusted more than anyone in the world. Jack dialed quickly, his thumb pressing the buttons with the confidence of muscle memory. It rang only once before a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Jack," came the deep, gravelly voice of Sergeant Mike, a man Jack had known for decades. They'd served together in the toughest of conditions, and Mike, a former Navy SEAL, had seen things most men couldn't even imagine. Despite being in his 50s, Mike was still in peak physical condition, his sharp mind and tactical skills making him a formidable force even now. He was the kind of man you wanted on your side when things got serious. "We've got trouble," Jack said, his voice calm, but with an underlying urgency that only someone like Mike could pick up on. Mike didn't need an explanation. He knew that if Jack was calling, it wasn't for something trivial. "Where is she?" Mike asked, already on the move, pulling on his jacket. "She's at the diner. It's the bikers," Jack replied, each word measured. He didn't have time for long explanations. Mike understood the stakes without them. There was a brief silence on the other end, and Jack could almost hear the wheels turning in Mike's mind as he formulated a plan. "I'm on my way," Mike said firmly, hanging up without another word. With that settled, Jack grabbed his jacket and stepped outside into the cold rain, his old service dog, Rex, by his side. Rex had been with him for years, a constant companion through thick and thin. The dog was aging, just like Jack, but still alert and loyal. Jack placed a hand on Rex's back, feeling the familiar fur beneath his fingertips, and the two of them set off into the night. Jack didn't need his eyes to navigate the streets. He'd lived in this town long enough to know every turn, every bump in the road. His cane tapped lightly against the pavement as Rex guided him, the cold rain soaking through his jacket. But he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting to Jessica. He knew what kind of danger she was in, and though the thought of confronting those bikers stirred old, buried memories of violence, Jack's resolve was stronger than his fear. He walked with purpose, his senses heightened. The sound of distant cars, the feel of the cold wind on his face, the smell of wet earth, all of it told him exactly where he was. He wasn't the soldier he used to be, but he still had his instincts, and those instincts told him that time was running out. He quickened his pace, feeling Rex pull forward slightly, as if the dog understood the urgency. Jack's mind flashed back to the last time he had crossed paths with these bikers. It had been years ago, during a heated dispute over land rights, and Jack had stood his ground despite their threats. He had paid the price for it, but he'd never regretted it, not for a second. And now, knowing that they were targeting Jessica, he felt the old fire rise within him. As he neared the diner, Jack's grip on his cane tightened. He knew he was walking into danger, but nothing, no amount of fear or risk, would stop him from protecting his daughter. He could only hope that Mike would arrive in time. Back at the diner, the atmosphere is thick with tension. The rain pattered against the windows, the neon sign outside flickering in the darkness, casting an eerie glow inside. Jessica could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her face as composed as possible. Snake loomed over her, his eyes filled with malice. And the bikers, emboldened by his presence, chuckled cruelly, feeding off the fear that hung in the air. Jessica knew she had to keep them talking, to buy time. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice steady, but edged with unease. "Whatever you think you're getting out of this, it's not worth it." Snake sneered, leaning closer. "You think I care what you have to say? Your old man couldn't stop us then, and he sure as hell can't now." Across the diner, the patrons sat frozen in place, their eyes darting between Jessica and the bikers. They were clearly terrified, no one daring to speak up or intervene. The waitress, an older woman with a concerned expression, hovered near the counter, clutching a coffee pot as if it were a lifeline. The once cozy diner had become a prison of fear, with Snake and his crew holding the keys. Snake took a step closer, reaching out to grab Jessica's arm. She flinched, but before his hand could touch her, the door to the diner swung open with a sudden creak. All heads turned as a figure stood in the doorway. Jack, leaning on his cane, rainwater dripping from his jacket, filled the entrance. He was soaked from his walk through the storm, but his posture was straight, his face set with a calm yet unwavering expression. Despite his blindness, there was an air of command about him, the kind of presence that comes from years of facing danger and not backing down. For a brief moment, even the bikers seemed to falter, caught off guard by the blind man's unexpected arrival. "I suggest you let go of my daughter," Jack said evenly, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that silenced the entire room. It was a voice that demanded respect, that spoke of experience, of a man who had faced far worse than a group of rowdy bikers. Snake stared at him for a second, then broke into a mocking laugh. "You've got some nerve showing up here, old man," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What are you going to do? You can't even see what's in front of you." By the minor generations before, barking terms against the rules leading to desperate behavior. The bikers laughed, emboldened by their leader's bravado, but Jack didn't flinch. He stood tall, his grip firm on his cane, his eyes fixed forward despite his blindness. Jessica watched her father, a flicker of hope sparking within her, for he knew that when Jack showed up, things were about to change. Before Snake could make another move, the door swung open again with a bang. This time, it wasn't just one man. In walked Mike, his presence immediately commanding the room. Behind him were two other men, all former military, all hardened by years of service. Mike's sharp gaze scanned the room, taking in the situation with the practiced calm of a soldier assessing a battlefield. The bikers' laughter died in their throats as they realized the shift in power. Snake's cocky grin faded as he glanced between Jack and Mike. The two ex-military men stood in stark contrast to the bikers. Where Snake's crew was wild and reckless, Mike and his men were disciplined, quiet, but radiating an unspoken promise of swift and decisive action if things escalated. Mike stepped forward, his eyes locked on Snake. "I'd listen to him if I were you," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that made it clear this was not a negotiation. "You're outnumbered, and you're outmatched." For a moment, the diner was steeped in thick silence. The patrons watched, with bated breath, as the tension in the room reached its peak. On one side, Snake and his crew, their bravado faltering under the weight of the new arrivals. On the other, Jack and his old war comrades, standing firm, ready to protect Jessica and anyone else who needed it. Snake clenched his fists, his eyes darting between Jack, Mike, and his own men. He wasn't used to backing down, but he wasn't stupid either. He could see the odds had shifted, and it wasn't in his favor anymore. His crew, once so sure of themselves, now hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. There was a moment of intense silence, like the calm before a storm, where it felt like anything could happen. The bikers stood tense, unsure whether to fight or flee. The air in the diner crackled with the potential for violence, but also with the possibility of an unexpected resolution. Everyone, from the patrons to Jessica herself, held their breath, waiting to see which way the confrontation would tip. Jack, still calm despite the tension, took a step forward, leaning on his cane but standing tall. "You have a choice," he said quietly, his voice steady, almost gentle, but with a firmness that made it clear this was their last chance. "Walk away, and no one gets hurt. Stay, and you won't like what happens next." Snake's jaw tightened, his pride warring with his survival instincts. He could sense the strength in Jack's words, and the men behind him weren't the kind to bluff. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Snake signaled to his crew. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, his voice laced with anger but tempered by reluctant respect. One by one the bikers filed out, their earlier bravado reduced to muttered curses and stolen glances over their shoulders. As they left, the tension in the diner slowly began to dissipate, like the air returning to a room after a long-held breath. Jack didn't move until the last of them had gone, and then, slowly, he turned toward Jessica. She rushed to him, relief flooding her features. "You okay, sweetheart?" Jack asked softly, reaching out to pull her into a gentle embrace. Jessica nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Thanks, Dad. You were amazing." Jack smiled, the weight of the moment easing as he held her close. "I'll always be here when you need me." Snake, cornered and driven by his bruised ego, wasn't ready to give up just yet. His pride flared in the face of defeat, and he decided to push his luck one last time. With a defiant sneer, he lunged forward, his fist aimed straight at Jack. The diner seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, as if time itself had slowed in the face of the impending clash. But before Snake's fist could make contact, Mike moved with lightning speed. Years of military training kicked in, his reflexes sharp and honed. In a blur of motion, he stepped in between Jack and the biker, his hand snapping up to block the punch with practiced ease. Snake's fist was caught mid-air, the force of his blow absorbed by Mike's calm and calculated response. The tension exploded into action. What followed wasn't a chaotic brawl, but a display of military precision, efficiency, and control. Mike's team, all former soldiers like him, sprang into action. They moved like a well-oiled machine, their training evident in every movement. One of them swiftly disarmed a biker, who reached for a concealed weapon, twisting his arm in a controlled motion that left the biker wincing in pain, but uninjured. Jessica, standing frozen by the booth, watched in awe. The chaos she had feared moments before transformed into a masterclass of discipline. Mike's team didn't rely on brute force. Instead, they used their knowledge of hand-to-hand combat to subdue the bikers with minimal harm. A sweep of the legs here, a pressure point hit there, and within seconds, Snake and his crew found themselves disarmed and immobilized, their arrogance crumbling under the weight of defeat. Snake, now lying on the ground, winded and stunned, looked up at Jack. He was humiliated, his earlier confidence shattered. He had underestimated the blind veteran and his friends, and now he lay defeated, his gang sprawled around him, groaning in pain. Snake's eyes locked onto Jack's, his earlier bravado replaced with a flicker of fear. Jack remained exactly where he had stood, calm and composed, throughout the entire ordeal. His hand rested lightly on his cane, his sightless eyes fixed ahead, but it was clear that he had known everything happening around him. His senses, sharpened by years of both combat and blindness, had never needed his eyes to guide him. Slowly, Jack stepped forward, his cane tapping softly against the floor with each step. The sound of the cane echoed through the diner, a subtle reminder of Jack's quiet strength. He stopped just a few feet from Snake, standing over him, his presence towering despite his blindness. "This is the last time you'll ever bother my family," Jack said, his voice calm, yet cold. There was no anger in his tone, just a simple statement of fact, a finality that hung heavy in the air. Snake, panting and bruised, stared up at Jack, knowing he had no fight left in him. He had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. Mike and his team stood nearby, watching closely, but they knew their part was done. The bikers, now subdued, had no fight left in them. They were defeated, not just physically, but mentally as well. The realization that they had underestimated Jack and his old comrades weighed heavily on them. Snake, with no other choice, gave a reluctant nod. Slowly he climbed to his feet, wincing as he did so. He cast one final look at Jack, but it wasn't one of defiance anymore. It was the look of a man who knew he had been beaten. Not just by strength, but by something deeper. By honor, by discipline, by the unbreakable bond between father and daughter. With a gesture to his crew, Snake muttered something under his breath, and one by one the bikers limped out of the diner, defeated and humiliated. The storm outside had subsided, but the air inside the diner was thick with the weight of what had just transpired. As the door swung shut behind them, a slow clap began to rise from the patrons. At first, it was hesitant, uncertain, but then it grew. The waitress, still clutching the coffee pot, was the first to clap, followed by a man sitting by the counter. Soon the entire diner was applauding, their faces a mix of relief and admiration. Jack stood still, his head slightly bowed, acknowledging the crowd's gratitude with a modest nod. For him, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about protecting his daughter, just as he always had, just as he always would. Jessica rushed over to her father, her eyes brimming with emotion. She threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "Dad," she whispered, her voice choked with gratitude. "You didn't have to do this." Jack smiled softly, his hand gently patting her back. "I'll always protect you, Jess," he said, "no matter what." Mike stepped forward, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You did good, Jack. It's over now." Jack nodded. "Thanks, Mike. Couldn't have done it without you." The tension that had once filled the diner was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and unity. The storm outside had passed, and inside there was only the warmth of shared relief. As Jack, Jessica, and Mike stood together, the clapping gradually died down, leaving only the soft hum of conversation, as life in the diner slowly returned to normal. But nothing would ever quite be the same again. The bikers were gone, and in their place, the people of the town had gained a new respect for the quiet, blind veteran and his daughter. Their strength, their courage, and the bond that no amount of violence or intimidation could ever break. As the bikers leave the diner, heads low, Jessica feels the weight of the moment hit her. The adrenaline fades, leaving her trembling. She rushes to her father, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispers, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to drag you into this." Jack, sensing her emotions, pulls her into a tight embrace. "You'll never have to face them alone, Jess," he says softly, his voice steady and full of love. "Not as long as I'm here." For a moment, they stand in the middle of the diner, holding each other. Jack can feel her tension easing, his arms providing the safety she needs. For Jack, it's a reminder of everything he's fought for, his daughter, his guiding light through darkness. Mike and the other veterans gather around, offering quiet words of comfort. Their bond, forged in battle, runs deep. Despite Jack's blindness, they all know his vision of what matters. Family, honor, love, remains clear. Mike nods at Jessica. "Your father's stronger than you think, Jess, and you've got us. Always." Jessica wipes her tears, overwhelmed with gratitude. She realizes her father was never truly alone, and neither is she. These men are her family, too. Jack gives Mike a nod of thanks. "We'll handle things here," Mike says. "You take Jess home." With that, Jack offers his arm to Jessica, and they walk toward the door, side by side. The storm outside has calmed to a drizzle, and the town feels different. As they step into the cool night air, Jessica feels a renewed sense of strength. Their bond has always been strong, but tonight it feels even more unbreakable. No words are needed. They'll always stand by each other through every storm and battle. Behind them, the diner patrons return to their meals, the tension replaced with quiet awe. The waitress glances out the window, watching father and daughter disappear into the night. "That's a man you don't mess with," she says, quietly. And as Jessica and Jack walk forward, they know that whatever life throws their way, they'll face it head-on, together. True strength isn't about physical ability, but about courage, loyalty, and the support of those we love. Jack, a blind veteran, proves that even in the face of danger, it's our inner resolve and the bonds we share with others that carry us through. This story reminds us that standing up for what's right, fueled by love and loyalty, will always lead to victory.